Good morning, everyone, and welcome to this webinar about European eel. You're going to have to bear with us to organize this. It's the first time we use this platform, so but I think we'll have a really good and interesting morning together. My name is Nikki Sprong, and I work for the Fisheries Secretariat with the Sustainable Eel Program, and I'm going to be your moderator today. And helping will be my co-organizer Clarissa Boomer from the Good Fish Foundation, Irene from the Good Fish Foundation, who's in charge of the question and answer sessions, and Christian and Jaco, who will help all of us with technical issues during the course of the morning. And thank you all speakers who've agreed to join us today and share their knowledge and experience on these important issues. I'm going to hand over now to Clarissa, who will tell you all a little bit about how it's going to work practically today. Thank you.
Thank you, Nikki. A very welcome to all of you, also on behalf of the Good Fish Foundation. It's such good news that so many people are attending this webinar. We have over 100 participants. We could never dreamt that it would be such a success. I'm looking forward to all the presentations. You've all received the agenda. It's also available in the chat box. During this webinar, we have 2 breaks, and it's for you to get a cup of coffee or stretch your legs. If you stay behind your computer, you will enjoy some footage about eel underwater, or some animated videos about eel. After each presentation, there will be 5 minutes questions, and you can put your question in the Q&A box. And at the end of the webinar, we have a wider session of questions. My request is, if you want to put the name of the speaker to the question, so we know who needs to answer the question. So this concerns the wider session. Behind the curtains, on this not visible on your screen, are Jaco and Christian taking care of all the technique. If you encounter any problems, please write it down in the Q&A box, and they will try to solve your technical problems. You have seen now Nikki and myself. You will also see Irene Kranendonk from the Good Fish Foundation later today, and she will take care of all the questions. That's it for now. The webinar will be recorded, and also at the moment we have succeeded to live stream it on the Facebook page of the Good Fish Foundation. I think you have to look for VISwijzer. That's it for now. I wish you a very pleasant morning, and I hope we will have some very interesting discussions and webinars. Back to you, Nikki.
Thank you, Clarissa. I want to introduce our first speaker, who's Jan-Dag Pohlmann, an eel scientist who's also the chair of the Joint Scientific Working Group on Eels, IFAC, ICES, and GFCM. And he is going to kick off this morning by giving us a bit of a biological background and status of the eel population. The screen is yours, Jan-Dag.
Okay, so I'm going to start and try to share my presentation. Thanks, by the way, for reminding me that this is streamed on Facebook and will be recorded. Pressure is up, I guess. So can you see the presentation? Does that work? Can you hear me?
Yep, everything works fine. We can hear you and we can see the presentation.
Okay, thank you very much. So I'll start with the biology of eel. I think we can get this out of the way quite quickly and get to the interesting part, the population status of the European eel, and I will walk you through what we know about it from ICES and the EU management program mostly. Eel biology can, well, it doesn't work. Oh. Okay. Eel biology. Well, the important parts of eel biology can basically be summarized in a single graph, or even in a single sentence. The one thing you need to remember is that every eel that you will ever see hatched in the Sargasso Sea. It was born in the Sargasso Sea. It doesn't matter if you're in Iceland or in the UK or in Turkey. All the eels you will ever see were born in the Sargasso Sea, because there's just one population of eels, and we can't artificially reproduce eels. They are panmictic, meaning there's one population, panmictic species, migratory species spawning in the Sargasso Sea, which is around here, southeast of Bermuda in the Atlantic Ocean. And then the larvae, they drift towards the continent, and they arrive here as glass eels. Sometimes they are pigmented, or then we would call them elvers or young yellow eels. And they immigrate to coastal waters, to freshwater, to all kinds of freshwater lakes, rivers, trenches, ponds. You will find them anywhere. Stay here for 5, 6, 7, 8 to more than 20 years, depending on if they're males or females. Males will not stay that long, and you will usually have more males if you're closer to the spawning grounds. And once they mature, they turn into silver eels, and then they migrate back to the Sargasso Sea. And this is basically, that sums up the important parts about eel biology. There's lots of details you can know, but for the management and understanding the population status, that should do it. A big problem in describing the population status of eel is that there's a big knowledge gap. We don't know much about the oceanic phase of eels. There's no data on spawners, on the amount of spawners that arrive in the Sargasso Sea, and there's barely data on the larvae in the Sargasso Sea. Actually, there's one survey which is conducted by our institute every 3 years, going to the Sargasso Sea. Not this year due to Corona, sadly, but it's just the starting time series, and we don't have enough cruises yet to really give an idea of the development of larvae in the Sargasso Sea. So a good point to start is the continental life phase of the European eel, and where we have quite good data, empiric data, is the glacial arrival on the European coasts. And as I just said, we only have one population of eels, but it's scattered across the continent. The distributional range is from Iceland to Northern Africa, throughout the Mediterranean and the Baltic Sea. And it's really a challenge. You have many, many different management units. So these are not the countries, these are eel management units, which you see, the ones where we have data of different qualities. And it's really, really scattered. And always keep in mind, it's just one population. Across the European coasts, we have monitoring stations for glass eels, and they're run by different countries. And I think right now 46 are used for the glass eel recruitment index. And this is the best piece of empiric data, in my opinion, that we have on the state of the stock. And the recruitment index is basically the abundance of glass eel arriving at the European coasts in relation to the average of eels that arrived from 1960 to 1979, I guess. What you can see, if you've ever looked at the ICES advice for European eel, you know these graphs. And this is the glass eel recruitment index. The blue greenish line is for the North Sea, and the orange line is for the other monitoring stations. And what you can see is that there was a steep decline in the eel population since the 1980s. And it's more or less, well, it arrived at a low around the start of the millennium, a little later. And there was a turning point in 2011. And after that, the population or the recruitment increased. And basically the trend, up here for the yellow eel, it's just young yellow eels also recruits, looks mostly the same. And the glass eel recruitment increased after 2011. This is the latest news from the last year's WGEEL report, which is good news. But I like to spend some time on this graph because I've seen it a lot lately, and it's been taken out of context some time. The first thing that you should recognize is that this is a logarithmic scale. So 1 unit here is 1 unit here is 10 units of this scale, and so on. So any slope you see here is much more pronounced than it is in the original graph. This is the same data, and it looks much more of an increase than it actually is. This is one thing. It's a significant change. After 2011, there is a change in the trend, and it is significantly different from zero, so there is an increase. But also it's based on preliminary data. When this was calculated, not all the data for 2019 was available, and we don't have too many years after 2011. So this is not too strong an argument. We should be happy that we see something like that. But it's not a clear sign for a recovery of the stock, and we should keep that in mind. And this is also reflected in the IC's advice on fishing opportunities. We're not there yet. We're still on a very low level, and the stock is still outside of safe biological limits. And this is why IC's still recommends to keep anthropogenic mortalities as close to or as close to zero as possible. The other two continental life stages are yellow eel and silver eel, and we do have quite some time series. I was surprised how many there are that were reported during the data calls. However, they haven't been analyzed yet, so this is the next step. So stay tuned for the next WG eel report. I think there's going to be some interesting new data on the eel stock. I think Cedric, the stock coordinator, is listening, so the pressure is up. We need to provide this year. This is going to be interesting, but that's it basically for empiric data that we have on the stock, and that's not very much, and this is due to logistic challenges. Imagine that yellow eels are scattered all across the continents, all across different water bodies, and it's basically impossible to just go there and count them all. And what is done by the EU through the eel management plans, there's a lot of management measures implemented. I'm not going to talk about those, but there's also a lot of data collected. You've seen this graph up here before with all the management units. And this huge problem of the whole population is basically split into many smaller problems for each of the management units. Data is collected separately, and mostly the escapement of silver eels is calculated, and the abundance of yellow eels too, but focuses on silver eels. And the idea, the management target is, or you might have heard the terms 3 Bs and A. Let's start with that. The Bs are biomass indicators. The A is a mortality indicator. You have the B0, which is the pristine escapement. This is a value. What would you expect to be the amount of eels that escape from a certain management unit if there had never been an anthropogenic impact? B current is the amount of silver eels that escape today, and B best is the amount of silver eels that could escape today if we reduce all anthropogenic mortalities to 0. And the idea is, if you have 40% escapement of your B0, of the pristine escapement, then you're in the clear. Then your unit is managed well. Remember, it's just 1 unit; it's a whole population, so that also has to apply to the whole population. That's a challenge. If you are below that, oh, there's my mouse cursor. If you are below that 40% target, you will have to reduce your mortality to increase your escapement. So if you look at this graph, this is your B0, this 40%, that's your target. If you're below that, in this area here, your mortality will be low enough to increase the stock. In this area, your mortality will be too high. You won't increase your stock. And this is the precautionary graph for all the eel management units for all the data we have. It's from 2017. It's only updated every 3 years. So there's going to be a new one next year. And here you see all the values for all the eel management units. There's the escapement biomass, and there you have the anthropogenic mortality. If you're in this green area, you're in the clear. Your management unit is managed fine. Doesn't mean you can increase your mortalities, because there's many other management units that are not that good. But as you can see, the point here is for the majority of management units, we don't have very good values for escapement or mortality. Another way of looking at this is basically the same data, but it's a bit clearer, I guess, is this graph. It's a map of Europe, compiled of all the data that we have. And if you see a gray circle, that's the B0, that's the escapement you would expect if there had never been any anthropogenic mortalities. The red circle is the 40% management target, so that's 40% of B0. The yellow circle, that's the best escapement that you can have today, and the green circle is the actual escapement that you have. So in short, if you only see green, like here, well, there's some data missing, there's a sad face, like here, that's good. Your actual escapement is even bigger, or at least as big as B0. I'm not judging the data quality here. It might be true or might not be true. If you see some yellow, if you see red, you're below your 40% target. If you see yellow, you could increase your current escapement. And as you can see, you almost always see red circles. So across Europe, the population status is still critical, and there's still a lot of work to do. And there's some good management plans from the EU in place. And I think we're going to hear about that from Kasia. And I haven't watched the time, but usually I'm a bit faster, but I think I managed quite well to stay within the 50 minutes. So that's it from me about the population status. I hope you enjoyed it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jan-Dag. You did indeed stay within the limits. The floor is open for questions. So I'm giving the floor to Irene, and I hope we have some interesting questions come in for you, Jan-Dag. Thank you for your presentation.
Thank you, Nikki. I am Irene Kraamdonk from the Good Fish Foundation, and I'll be doing the Q&A today. I will read the questions from the Q&A out loud to the speakers so they can answer them. Okay. We only have one question at the moment, so the Q&A is open for questions from the attendees. We have a question from Clarissa. Clarissa, she's wondering, Jan-Dag, what should be the focus for the recovery of the eel, in your opinion, in Europe?
In my opinion, well, I don't think we have a clear focus. There's many potential reasons that cause the decline. We cannot really single one out. We have habitat loss, we have fisheries, we have pollution, we have potential oceanic impacts, climate. So it's difficult to say where we can focus the recovery of the stock. I think the most important thing is that we figure out a way to deal with the management of the European eel. And this is something, what I try to show is that we really have to distinguish between the whole population, which is the level that we need to address, because there is just one population, and we don't win much if we just focus on a single EMU. But on the practical side, we can only focus on the EMUs, and bringing those two together, this is very important, I think, and this should be the focus of the future work. And we're working on that actually, to have a workshop focusing on, yeah, what kind of data do we have, and how can we use it to answer that exact question, actually, what to focus on for the recovery.
Okay, thank you. I have another question from Emmanuel. He or she is asking, does the size of the circles on the map indicates the size of the stock in the country?
Yeah, not the size of the stock, the size, it's escapement. I don't think we have ever done that or that ICES has ever done that for the standing stock of yellow eel. That is just silver eel escapement, yeah, but the size of the circle indicates that. And as I mentioned briefly, the data quality might be very different, and the approach to getting the data. A lot of the time it's modeling, but there's usually a high uncertainty in the input data. So that is part of the reason. My guess is the question is like, okay, some circles are really big, some circles are really small. How does that work? Yeah, there's huge uncertainty probably in the data.
All right, thank you. Referring to that question, there's another question from Catherine. She is asking, on the last map, there were a lot of sad smileys, which I assume means a lack of data.
Yeah.
What needs to be done to increase the data knowledge? And there's also another question from Johnny. Which countries would you say are doing the best at recovering the eels?
Which countries are doing best? Well, I kind of have a policy of not naming and shaming, and I wouldn't do the other thing. But you could highlight Ireland, because Ireland it has closed their eel fishery completely. It's not that I expect that from every country, but of course that's the best you can do to reduce anthropogenic mortalities wherever you can. But it's not only fisheries; it's also others. And what can we do to increase the data that we have? I don't know, to be honest. We're reaching out from WG Eel. We work on that constantly to increase increase our reach to address all countries and ask nicely for the data. And there's the data collection framework by the EU that's providing us with a lot of data. So I think we're doing everything we can to get the data, but it's just sometimes it's a logistic problem. It's just data is just not available, and it's just not always a priority for every country, I guess, to collect data on eel. But it's a tough question to be. I don't really know how to answer that.
Okay, then I think we have time for one more question from Katalin. He or she is asking, do you have any scientific data on the impacts of restocking, and what do these show in terms of the success of restocking?
Yes, there is data on restocking, and there's very different opinions, and there's very different results from restocking. Again, I don't think my personal opinion matters too much. We know that some studies showed that, or we have some EMUs that really depend on restocking, otherwise they wouldn't be near the 40% management target. On the other hand, restocking is a problem if you stock into areas with high natural mortalities. So, and given the fact that we can't artificially reproduce eels, it's at least there's no proof that restocking increases the net benefit for the stock, that there's any benefit from the stock from restocking. But if it's done, it should be done in areas where there's a high probability of escapement, and that's also what the ICES advise. It should be checked in advance that there's low mortality in areas where fish are restocked, and that they have a good chance of escaping.
Okay, thank you. That was it for this Q&A session. Apologies if we didn't manage to answer all of the questions. Back to you, Nikki.
Thank you, Irene. And well, we'll see how it goes, but maybe some of the unanswered questions could be taken up later in the open Q&A session at the end. Thank you very much for that, Jan-Dag. And just to the attendees, all of our speakers will be around for the final Q&A at the end. So if you realize that you should have asked Jan-Dag something and completely forgot about it now, you still have another chance later on. Thank you. I now would like to introduce Katarzyna Janiak, who works at the European Commission and is responsible for the eel evaluation at DG Mare, and she's going to give us an update on the evaluation that was made of the eel regulation and future steps. Welcome, Katarzyna.
Yes, thank you very much for giving me a chance to finally talk about the results of the evaluation. that has been published in February, and we were hoping to start with kind of outreach to different stakeholders and to promote the results and to encourage all participants to read the results and to start progressing. Oh, do you hear me, please? It looks like my speaker is not working.
Oh, now it's clearer, but yeah, there was disturbance.
Ah, maybe it's the connection.
Okay.
I will maybe get closer to my laptop. And then we have entered the confinement, so all our actions were actually postponed. So I'm very glad to be able to do this presentation online. So let me try to share my screen. That's always technicalities. Okay, let's try this one. Share. Do you see my presentation?
I see your presentation fine, Katarzyna. There's still some issue with the sound. I don't know whether your microphone is at the bottom of your computer, then you should be careful moving your hands in front of it. Maybe that could be, it sounds like a sort of a general noise disturbance.
Oh.
Comes and goes. Okay.
Well, I don't have a headphones, so that's, maybe I'm gonna get closer. Yes, okay. So, does it work now? Yes. I will quickly go through the legal framework on eels, what in addition EU has done to have recovered the eel. I'll talk about the evaluation and what are the next steps. Briefly, our main framework is very comprehensive. It's the Eel Regulation that sets measures for recovery of eel. We have also other EU regulations related to wildlife trade, and the member states have agreed not to allow exports and imports in December 2010. So it is not possible to trade eel outside of the EU. However, we can market the European eel in the EU itself. And then we have recently set the 3 months closure for eel fisheries since 2019 under the so-called tag and quotas regulation in support of the Eel Regulation. And then at the international level, we also have provisions that refers to trade under CITES, because the European Eel has been added to Appendix II. And the trade needs to be regulated, and to be able to trade eel, you need the NDF. But I guess our following speaker will talk a little bit more about it. Under the Convention of Migratory Species, we also have scope for international cooperation on European eel. We also have a speaker in this webinar, so I see we cover main aspects. And at the regional level, also international, because it's with per countries. At the GFCM, so General Fisheries Commission for Mediterranean, it's a fisheries organization. They have adopted a recommendation that sets eel management plans and launched the research projects on eel.
Katarzyna?
Yes?
It seems we still have a so we still have an issue with your sound. I don't know whether somehow you can change your position and see if it improves.
Well, I'll try.
It sounds good now. It's really strange.
So maybe if I move my head, then it's a little bit different. or if I speak slower?
Well, it's just now, it sounds absolutely fine, which was the case before as well. So just...
I try not to move.
Yeah. Okay, I'm really sorry about this. I'm not sure what we can do to to help you, because it's something to do with your microphone, I think.
Yes, yes.
Sorry for interrupting.
Sorry.
Yeah.
No, I'm sorry for that, because yes, it's also not good for the audience not to be able to hear me properly. So my apologies as well. I think most of us know what are the requirements for the member states. That was under the Eel Regulation. Member states had to come up with eel management plans, and their main objective was to achieve 40% escapement. This is what Jan-Dag was explaining before, what is the situation. There are other requirements for member states to reserve 60% of glass eel catches for restocking. For those member states, they have a glass eel, but also some member states decided their own restocking targets, even though they don't have a glass eel fisheries. And also there was a requirement to reduce fishing effort or catches. And we have regular reporting obligation under the Eel Regulation every 3 years since the entry into force of the regulation, and then every 6 years starting from last reporting in 2018. However, based on the declaration on eel that member states agreed in December 2017, they have committed to continue reporting on 3 years basis. So I would like to also remind this very important political commitment that we continue reporting on 3 years basis. In the Commission, we are monitoring the status of eel, and we are actually cooperating with ICES, that we are requesting them to give us advice on the state. And we have also ad hoc requests, and most recent was about the immigration patterns that we are still analyzing. So I mentioned a few actions that we have recently put in place. And one of those was also to carry out a formal evaluation of the Eel Regulation. And in addition, from 2019, we have added European Eel in the scope of the so-called specific control and inspection program under the EU control regulation. And with the involvement of European Fisheries Control Agency, there will be more action on eel control of eel fishing. We work with international partners because, of course, eel is spread around Europe, and it does not limit into the EU boundaries. It goes further. So we have to work with third countries, mainly through GFCM, but also we have in the Baltic part of Russian Federation to ensure comprehensive coordinated approach. And the EU and its member states have agreed to work with CMS and other countries on the development of the action plan for European eel. So these are quick main results of the evaluation of the Eel Regulation. Basically, what evaluation found is that the regulation is fit for purpose, but implementation needs improvement. And what is very important to note that thanks to the Eel Regulation, management of eels can cover all life stages, and it addresses fisheries and non-fisheries anthropogenic impacts, which is very specific for the regulation that was agreed in Fisheries Council, because it covers also non-fisheries aspects. We note the significant progress that has been done in reducing fishing effort. However, we could see, and it's confirmed by the scientific advice, that the silver escapement is well below 40% biomass in overall. And the status of eel stock remains still critical. We know that eel has a very long life cycle, that it's different in different regions. So it needs longer time to recover. Maybe before I start with that, the Eel Regulation has been put in place in 2007. Member states have put their eel management plans around 2009-10. So we are at 10, like a decade of the implementation time. So it needs more time to see the effectiveness of the Eel Regulation when it comes to the significant signs of the recovery. Main management tool under the Eel Regulation are eel management plans that have been developed by 19 member states. As you can see, there are around, well, almost 2,000 actions in those management plans. 6 member states were exempted, with some individual rivers basin. And then if we look at the main objective of the 40% escapement target, the evaluation found clear that only 2 member states have met this target. Several member states did not meet this target. Few member states met this target partially, and it was not clear in 5 member states. So the achievement of this target is very variable across the EU countries. So on average, that's why we said that it's well below 40%. The Commission is still evaluating the results of the evaluation, but we already came up with some principal issues that we would like to address in the near future. And especially that we could see that not all member states presented their eel management plans. We have new member states and also Bulgaria for the rivers outside the Black Sea. I mentioned here where we have a clear view which member state did not meet the escapement target. We also see that not all member states achieved their 60% glass eel restocking. There are also some issues with practices of restocking in member states. If you read the report by the Commission, you could see there is extensive part on the control and enforcement. This was done on purpose because we see that implementation needs a proper enforcement as well and monitoring. So we spent some time with external consultant to dig out this subject. And we have found there are issues with control, enforcement and monitoring obligations when it comes to small vessels below 10 meters, glass eel for restocking, traceability. We know there is no full traceability system in the EU. There are some issues with control in fresh waters and with the recreational fisheries. What is also for us important to know that there are some member states that they have not sufficiently reduced hydroelectric turbine and dams mortality. And there is a room for improvement between river basin management plans under the Water Framework Directive and eel management plans under the Eel Regulation. This is something we want to work together with in the Commission between 2 services like Fisheries and Maritime together with Environment Department. Another principal issue is that the reporting is incomplete. progress reports, and the reporting on the evolution of glass eel prices. And if we don't have appropriate reporting, we also cannot have a full picture about the situation. So it is very difficult also to take measures, management measures, if there are some information that is missing. Jan-Dag mentioned there are also data issues. So there is room for improving this aspect, definitely, if we want to have a proper science-based management process. I mentioned here another point that member states do not quantify direct costs of the implementation of the regulation. Because we were not able to quantify efficiency of the Eel regulation. So that's something we have realized during our evaluation. And we also looked into the use of the EU funds, in particular EMFF, European Maritime Fisheries Fund, and the previous fund. And we have found that indeed member states used EU funds, but on general level, the uptake is rather low, although there are availabilities. So that's everything at once in this slide. It was mentioned by Jan-Dag, and I also mentioned already, the stock remains in critical condition. So what more can we do to help? How to improve implementation of the eel management plans? What is the future of the regulation? What is the scope for increasing international cooperation? Well, I will give you some examples on first point in the next slide. We are considering how to tackle all the principal issues we have identified, but we know already now that all stakeholders need to put more efforts. Further ambition is needed, especially when it comes to addressing non-fisheries impacts on eel. This is in particular important because biodiversity and combating biodiversity loss is really a cornerstone of the European Green Deal, and it lays in the heart of the new EU biodiversity strategy. So these are examples or where we see areas that the implementation can be reinforced. We still should continue addressing fisheries impacts, although the biggest focus should be on non-fisheries factors, mainly making river passable for eels. Evaluation have found several good practices related to fisheries, traceability, river restoration, switching off hydropower. There are some source of inspirations for member states. Of course, then we need to reinforce control enforcement. Primarily, the responsibility is within the member states to enforce EU legislation. We also have, as a commission is guardian of the treaty and regulations, we also have some tools how to enforce better implementation. We need to think about how to strengthen transboundary cooperation for the management, for the control, because eel, as we know, European eel doesn't stay within EU borders. Yes, I mentioned improving connectivity between the river basin management plans and eel management plans. We are encouraging member states to make use of EU funds. We are thinking about how to improve efficiency of the reporting. So also together with Jan-Dag and other scientists and ICES, we hope to come up maybe with some, I don't know, more explanations, instruction, how to better report also from our side, we try to, for the next reporting period, to have more reports and better quality reports. So in that sense, we might also ask member states to consider revising eel management plans in light of scientific recent knowledge, because it is possible to revise plans. And so far, it was only one member state who actually revised twice their plan. And for other member states, this management plan was left like a static document. So there is something to think about what we can do, what member states can do, how to help improving implementation. That the main aim for doing this is to help the eel to recover. So what I mentioned, our priority is better implementation. So for a time being, at current situation, we are not thinking about opening the Eel Regulation. We would like to focus on how to make the Eel Regulation works better. So that's why we would need to cooperate with member states and all stakeholders. And currently we are not, it's not a priority for us to amend the Eel Regulation. So I would like to be clear on that. And this is also part of Commission mandate to focus on better implementation and enforcement of policies. So I hope we can together make it work better. And of course, eel is long-lived species, and it needs a little bit more time for us to see that recovery is really significant. Thank you. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Katarzyna. And as you probably all noticed, I've given Katarzyna a bit more time to finish her presentation since she had so much problem with the sound in the beginning. So what we're going to do is we're going to have a slightly shorter questioning session, since I think we also just need to have a chance to stretch our legs and leave our computer screens for a few minutes. I'm going to take the opportunity, since I'm the moderator, to actually ask the first question before I hand over to Irene. So Katarzyna, considering that you've now done the evaluations and you said that there's quite a lot of good practices that are surfacing in the different member states and that come to light with the evaluations, would it be possible with the Eel Regulation to have something similar to, because it's quite a complex issue with a lot of national implementation, but at the same time, we actually depend on countries doing things in a similar way and using best practices in order to keep track of progress and get the most out of the efforts that are made. So would it be possible to do something similar to with the Water Framework Directive, where you've had a sort of an EU level strategic coordinating body that can also produce guidance to member states on the best practices and basically help improve implementation? Thank you.
Thank you, Nikki. I actually having my notebook next to me because it's I will note down the questions. That's very good idea. Thank you for bringing up for the discussion. We are now considering different ways how to help member states to better implement the regulation. We could see that there are some issues with interpretation by member states. So that's definitely on our list to prepare some kind of helping document. I don't know what form it could have. And for this, we also need, of course, our colleagues across the Commission. So it's not only us as, let's say, responsible for the Eel Regulation, but because it stretches for non-fisheries impact, we need to have a wide consultation. So yes, all ideas from all stakeholders are very welcome. We would like to consider many of them. We have been informed about different ideas in the stakeholders consultations, but of course there were so many ideas that we need to now prioritize, but definitely focusing on member states, better implementation and providing them some kind of guidance. It's something that we were thinking, but I'm not sure we would call it guidance, but definitely, yes, that's a very good idea. And we are thinking about it.
Thank you. I'm going to hand over to Irene now, but I suggest that we just take a couple of questions and then we have the break. And I would still like us to return to our screens again at 10:25, even though that makes for a very short break. So I hope that's all right with everyone. Thank you.
Thank you, Nikki. We have quite a lot of questions in the Q&A. I'm going to do a couple. First one is from Sien. She's asking if the whole population is one population. Are there also arrangements with countries like Morocco and other countries in the distribution area which are not part of the EU?
Yes, thank you for that question. We do have a cooperation with third countries. Around the Mediterranean, there is a specific arrangement within the fisheries management organizations. I mentioned GFCM. Of course, this is the fisheries related organization, but under CITES and CMS, and there is a cooperation in place. And for us, we also see that the third countries are part of the scientist expert group. And here we also have exchange of information, and yeah, we definitely need more cooperation with third countries. We cannot do only within the EU member states. We cannot help the eel to fully recover if we don't have all countries on board. Thank you.
Thank you for your answer. Then we have another question from Leah. She's asking, is the revision of the Eel Regulation, the recent revision, still relevant? For example, the effectiveness of restocking is being questioned in this report. A ban on glass eel fisheries is more effective. This could be included in an amendment.
Yeah. Well, for the restocking, indeed, there are issues with restocking, but we have to also think about how the restocking practices are carried out by member states. So here, first, we need to make efforts to improve implementation in a sense that the practices are more effective and efficient, that they actually contribute to eel being able to go back to the sea and spawn. We can see that in many countries, eels are stocked above dams and they don't have a chance to go back. So in that sense, we don't need at the moment to revise the regulation. We just need to focus on better implementation. And on the question about the ban of glass eel fishing, well, then we would not be able to actually restock eels in other countries. So there were difficult discussions in the Fisheries Council once we have put temporary fishing ban, and that was one of the reasons why we don't have a full ban all year round. That was negotiated with member states. So we wanted to allow glass eel fisheries to be able to keep the conservation measures. One of them is restocking. Thank you.
All right, great. Thank you for your answer.
Thank you, Katarzyna. Yeah, sorry, Irene. Sorry, I interrupted you. Go ahead.
Yeah, yeah. So there was this for this Q&A. Save your questions for the Q&A session at the end of the webinar, because the speakers will still attend, because there are many questions that cannot be answered right now.
Yes.
Okay, thank you very much, Katarzyna, for your presentation. I'm sorry about the technical issues. It's now 9:25 and we were supposed to start again. So I'm going to suggest that we take a 5-minute break and reconvene at well, 10:30 your time. Sorry, I'm in the UK. I'm confused. And so I'll see you all in 5 minutes. Okay? Thank you very much.
For centuries, people have wondered where European eels come from. Aristotle thought eels emerged from the mud, declaring,
"Eels are derived from the so-called Earth's guts that grow spontaneously in mud and in humid ground."
Pliny the Elder had a different theory.
Eels rub against rocks and the scrapings come to life. This is their only way of breeding.
But the truth is even more amazing, and it was only revealed because in 1904, a young Danish biologist called Johannes Schmidt took on the long task of trawling the Atlantic Ocean for young eel larvae. 20 years later, he had tracked the smallest specimens to an area in the Sargasso Sea, home to the Bermuda Triangle and known for its floating beds of sargassum seaweed. The larvae here were so tiny, less than a centimetre long, that Schmidt was convinced they could not have originated anywhere else. Eels begin their lives as eggs in the Sargasso, rising from the depths toward the light at the surface. They hatch into transparent larvae shaped like willow leaves and are carried towards Europe on ocean currents. This journey spans an astonishing 6,000 kilometers and can take up to 2 years to complete. It is the longest known migration of any eel species, and less than 1 in 500 larvae are thought to survive. By the time they reach coasts ranging from Scandinavia to North Africa, larvae develop into thin glass eels, about 6 centimeters long. As they begin their search for a home, they darken to become elvers, gaining camouflage against predators as they continue to grow. Young elvers are determined creatures. They will surf tides, cross land, and even climb vertical surfaces on their migration upstream. It is a perilous journey. They must dodge many predators, as eels are an important source of food for a variety of fish, mammals, and birds. Once an elver has found a suitable habitat, with good hiding spots and plentiful food, it will settle down to live and grow there, transforming into a yellow eel. Males may live in this state for up to 12 years, while larger females may spend as long as 20 years as yellow eels, and grow up to a metre long. It is unclear what sparks the change, but when a yellow eel is ready, it will turn into a silver eel to begin its migration back to the Sargasso Sea. It will alter its body chemistry to cope with salt water. Its stomach will shrink to save energy for the journey, and its pupils will become larger, allowing it to see in the low light conditions of the deep sea. Marine biologists are convinced that silver eels migrate back to the Sargasso to spawn and then die, but this life stage has never been witnessed, so it remains shrouded in mystery. Despite centuries of investigation, scientists are still attempting to answer key questions about the European eel's life cycle and behaviour. One thing we do know is that every eel in Europe has travelled a very long distance to get there. Generations before it have overcome huge odds in order to complete their mysterious life cycle and undertake one of the world's greatest unseen migrations.
They're long and slithery, and they're not very colorful, but they do have a strange beauty of their own. Their sinuous nocturnal movements through the
Hello again, everyone. Are we ready to go? Olle, you with us? Yes? Okay. Welcome back from the break. We're now going to move on to different aspects of eel. We're going to talk a bit more about the ways that we can manage things better, looking at both migration barriers and then at increased international cooperation. So I would like to introduce our next speaker, who is Olle Calles at Karlstad University in Sweden. He is a scientist who works predominantly with migration barriers and looking at the design of fish passages, and has some interesting things to tell you about how we can do things in a good way to help the eel swim up and down the rivers. Okay, Olle, the screen is yours.
Thanks. Does it look okay? Can you see a huge eel head? Yeah? Okay, great. So thanks a lot for inviting me. Like Nikki said, I work at Karlstad University on eels, but also on other migratory fish species. And so that's the topic of today. And we heard a lot about the situation for the European eel already. So we all know that it's in big problems. And this also holds true for other species like the Japanese eel and the American eel. So this situation is long gone, when we had tons and tons of juvenile eels, glass eels, along the European coasts. And that's why we got the European Eel Conservation Strategy back in 2007. And I'm deliberately skipping through this rather quickly now, since we heard a lot about legislation and strategies already. But I just want to point out the main actions of the Swedish eel management plan, which were to reduce the fishery, to increase control, but also to reduce turbine mortality and increase juvenile eel recruitment. And at that time, these two areas, numbers 3 and 4, were major knowledge gaps. We didn't know that much about downstream passage or upstream passage, and that's been one of our main study areas ever since. So today I'm going to tell you about a project on upstream passage for elvers, followed by 2 or perhaps 1.5 projects on downstream passage solutions for silver eels. And then I just wanted to quickly mention that we have a new PhD student that will be working on yellow eels, so foraging, growth, habitat use, and so on. So these are the different stages that we are working on. But the topic of today is eel passage. Right, so I'm working in Sweden. And well, this is where Karlstad is, in Karlstad University, just north of the largest lake within the EU, Lake Vänern. And our main study area when it comes to eels has been on the Swedish west coast. So we have this Kattegat sub-basin here and North Sea out here. Right, so moving over to the first project. And the short title is Win-Win Solutions for Hydropower and Nature. And this was funded by the National Research Council, Formas. And what we did here was, well, one thing we did was to look at coastal river connectivity. So what we did was that we used the Swedish National Electrofishing Database. And we extracted a lot of data from a bunch of rivers and a bunch of sites, more than 200. And I should tell you that we only selected sites where we know that there are no releases of imported eels. or any trap and transport activities. And the question we wanted to find the answer to was, do the existing upstream fish passage solutions work for juvenile eels? And bam, here we go. This is a generalized linear mixed model, so a bit too complicated for my taste. But what we see here is we have a bunch of factors on the left, and we see how they impact the probability of finding an eel upstream of a dam. So if they extend to the left, they have a negative impact. And if they extend to the right, they have a positive impact. And quickly, I'm moving on to the most important bars when it comes to fish passage. So what we saw was that dams equipped with eel ramps, technical fishways, had a negative impact on eel occurrence upstream. They were not different from dams without fishways. But when we looked at nature-like fishways, they didn't have a negative impact on eel occurrence. So if this holds true for other sites as well, we should all go for nature-like fishways if we want to enable juvenile eels to pass upstream. So such as the one shown here to your left. But what about the eel ramps then? They're really cost efficient, they're easy to install, and so on. So that was the next sub-project that we wanted to have a closer look at eel ramps. We know for a fact that maintenance is a big issue here. So these structures are not properly taken care of. They go dry, and they clog up with debris and so on. But what we wanted to take a closer look at was substrate. Because you probably know this already, but eel ramps are really simple structures. If you have a barrier that eels cannot overcome, then you put a board on it, basically. And for the eels to be able to climb that board, you need some kind of substrate. You also need water wetting the ramp, and typically you also apply attraction water, so a plunging flow, to tell the eels where to go to find the ramp. So we took a closer look at 3 different climbing substrate types. Studded substrate, which is quite common in North America. Open weave, which is very interesting because it's recommended in Sweden and Norway, and it's even legally required in Denmark. So bear that in mind. And then we have another commercially available substrate, the bristle substrate. So we took the ramps and the eels to the lab. We had 6 holding cages, and each holding cage consisted of a triple ramp with these 3 substrates randomly ordered. Then we put 10 eels, elvers, in the holding cage, 8 o'clock in the afternoon or night. And then we left them overnight. And then in the morning, the day after, we checked the traps or the buckets up here. And we also analyzed infrared video films that we recorded. So we ended up with a lot of catch data along with a bunch of videos looking something like this. So this is the base of the ramp, and we see an elver slowly making it up the ramp here. So which substrate did the eels use? Well, most of them actually used the studded, followed by open weave and bristle. But why did they do this? Well, we could also see that eels were more likely to approach the studded substrate. So for some reason, they were more attracted to ramps with the studded substrate. They also initiated more climbs, but there were no difference in the success per climb. So as long as they started climbing, it was quite similar in the success rate. Eels climbed the studded substrate way faster than the open weave, but I'm not showing that graph here today. So that was rather clear. And the next step was to validate these results in the field. So we took the same ramps, we put them on rafts because we have quite a variation in levels here at this site. This is River Lagan, again, Swedish west coast. And we left them here for a couple of nights fishing. And the map here shows you the location of the ramp, the triplet ramps, and also velocity vectors. So short arrow means that you had low water velocities, and the longer they get, the faster the water velocity. So a quick reminder of the lab results, followed by the field validation results. So more or less identical. And we also saw that we caught more eels along the northern bank with low water velocities as compared to the southern bank with high water velocities. So quite promising, but there's still a lot of things to improve to optimize the use of eel ramps. The next example is a project that was called the Hatting Project, or the performance of a two-way passage facility for diademous fish species. And a quick introduction to Riveratran. This is the catchment area, and the white area indicated here is what is available to diademous fish, assuming that they can pass the dams at Hatting and Nydala. So we spent quite a couple of years looking at the passage conditions at the Hatting Head, just next to the river mouth. And this is what it looks like from above. So the flow direction is from your upper right to your lower left. There are two powerhouses at this site, a large one down here inside an artificial channel, and a slightly smaller one next to the dam that used to dam what originally was the main stem of Riveratran. For fish passage, there was a technical fishway, the Eel fishway, close to the small powerhouse, and just next to it, there was one of these eel ramps. And for downstream passage, we kept a spill gate or a trash gate open for fish to pass just next to the turbine intake to the large powerhouse. This was not enough, however. This is not an amazing data set, but this is what we have on elver counts in this river. So there, you have to believe me when I say that the elver counts were really low before the modifications that happened at this site. So the power company decided to do something drastic to improve passage conditions for fish. So they took out most of the dam and turned it into, well, they tried to restore the old riverbed. For downstream passage, there was an angled rack or a screen installed here to guide eels and other fish species to the side to bypass, instead of them passing through the turbines. And up here, well, this is where the old dam used to be. So dam was taken away and replaced by two weirs with a full depth opening in the middle. And the old riverbed was restored or turned into a large nature-like fishway. And as you see here, the discharge here is very high, 11 cubics per second, which is equivalent to about 20% of the mean annual discharge in the river. And of course, this affected electricity production. So the large discharge and the lowered water levels upstream caused a reduction by 35%. Whereas the downstream passage solution did not negatively didn't have a negative impact on power production. So just to clarify, this is the old solution, conventional bar rack with a trash gate, and here is the new solution, a low sloping rack or an angled rack with a full depth bypass over here. So the project goals were pretty straightforward. The idea was to strengthen the diademous fish population, so salmon, eel, sea lamprey. And part of the idea with picking these species was that they're very different. They have contrasting life cycles and behaviors. So if the solutions work for these species, should also work for other migratory fish in the river. And what we did was to quantify passage efficiency, fish guidance efficiency, and passage time. So before and after the modifications. And we used a lot of different capture techniques, and we tracked fish using radio telemetry. And we also had access to data from the fish counters. So pretty much video cameras installed in the old and the new fishway. So a bit about the results for eels. Before modifications, the eels distributed between the two powerhouses, and most of them passed through the intake racks and turbines. And we had a survival of 70%, which sounds okay, but if you take into account that most eels in this river have to pass between 6 and 8 power plants to get to the sea, the total survival would be close to 0. So after modifications, we had a similar distribution between the two branches of the river, but we brought up the passage efficiency or the total survival to close to 100%. So a huge improvement. And we could also see some signs in regards of elver counts upstream after the modifications. And a more robust data set is on salmonid spawner counts, for which we also see a significant improvement after the modifications. But improving passage conditions also means that we make it easier to pass for unwanted guests, so invasive species like pink salmon and mitten crab. We don't know the consequences of their presence yet, but they have also increased in numbers upstream. So just quickly, just a glimpse from a project that we're currently working on, looking at details with those screens or angled racks, trying to find out how to optimize their design. And we're doing this in a huge flume, which is brand new. It was built by Vattenfall. And in here, we can pretty much mimic a small-scale hydropower plant intake channel. So each side of this recirculating flume is 30 meters long, 4 meters wide, 2 meters deep. And here we have models of these angled racks, bypasses. And we conduct experiments. So the inclined rack and the angled rack with different bar spacings. And this is what it looks like during operation. So pretty rough conditions. You don't want to fall in. And just to calm you down, if needed, all the eels that we have conducted our experiments on have been released afterwards. So we're not killing them. Right, so very brief. The Eel Project's take-home message. When it comes to elver upstream passage and habitat use, we have seen that nature-like fishways do the job best, but that eel ramps hold potential. We just have to learn how to optimize their design and placement. And when it comes to silver eel downstream passage solutions, we see that these inclined and angled racks are really efficient, not only for eels, but also other species. And a good thing, of course, with them is that they also allow maintained electricity generation. So now we're moving into trying to understand the individual variation, the mechanisms and potential population effects of that. So what we're doing right now is that we're recruiting 15 PhD students for a Marie Curie project with the acronym RIBES that will work on fish passage and related issues for the next 4 years. And that was it. Thanks for your attention. I think you're muted.
Oh, sorry. Thank you very much, Olle, for that presentation. So refreshing to get some very concrete results of practical work for someone who spends most of the time reading legal texts and talking about theories. Irene, I'm going to hand over to you for some quick questions, maybe 3, and then we should move on.
Yes, thank you, Nikki. The Q&A is open, so everybody can ask a question. I have a question myself, actually, Olle. I was wondering how big the knowledge sharing is between other institutions that do similar research as yours, and how specific the passages are that you design for a certain barrier. Can they be used for other barriers in other locations, or does that mean that that needs to be adapted technically?
We have quite a bit of exchange, but of course, large projects like the EU project that I mentioned just a minute ago helps a lot. But we're definitely communicating and exchanging ideas. So I got a lot of input in the early days from countries like Germany, France, US, Canada, and so on. I would say that all fish passage solutions are site-specific, but if we talk about the angled and inclined racks, you can use the same basic principles, but you have to modify. You have to modify the details to adapt to the site-specific conditions. So you can't really manufacture them, 100 of them, and just throw them out there. But you can definitely use the information and the knowledge that we have.
All right, great, thank you. Then we have another question from Charles Berkow. He is asking, in what time frame is it expected that the results of the project on watercourses would lead to a significant improvement in the escapement of silver eels?
I'm not exactly sure what project he's referring to.
I think the work in general on improving the migration.
Right. Well, quite a few projects. I mean, the main focus there is to design and implement solutions, and then of course they kick in immediately. Have taken, well, then they're up and running from day one, and of course they will have an impact on survival rates and so on. But the issue is, for example, with downstream passage, that we only have those solutions here and there. So that's a major issue now, that we have to implement them in, well, at all plants, for example, between a lake that's an important rearing ground for eels and the sea. So we're not really there yet, but there is a national relicensing process that's starting next year that will take a closer look at this and look at the rivers or the catchments one by one to look at the bigger picture right away and not just work at individual plants. So we're not there yet, but it's slowly happening.
Okay, thanks. And then the last question from Kim Friedman. He's thanking you for the very useful presentation. And he's asking if there are governmental incentives in Sweden to assist in such adaptations for electric companies.
Yeah, it's the relicensing process. So we have a national plan now, and there's a foundation that was initiated by the hydropower industry that's supposed to both fund and advise power plant owners on how to improve the environmental conditions at their plants. So a brilliant plan. It's not really up and running yet, but there's a good plan for it.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Well, we're looking forward. We're really looking forward to seeing the results of that in Sweden in future years. Now we're going to move on to the CITES listing of European eel and the attempts to control trade of a threatened species. So it's not only the European Eel Regulation that has been in place for more than 10 years, also the CITES listing on Appendix II. And so I'm going to hand over to Karen Gaynor, Scientific Support Officer at CITES, for some challenges and lessons learned that they've encountered during this time. Karen, the screen is yours.
Thank you. Can you hear me? Yeah, okay, great. First of all, I want to thank you for giving me this opportunity to address this webinar. I think it's a very important initiative. Let me see if I can quickly share this screen. Oh, let me see. Okay. Apologies. Okay, can you see my screen now? Can you see the screen? Someone can nod or...
Yes.
Yeah. Okay,
Yeah.
great.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. And of course, we seem to have skipped right down to the end for some reason. Okay, so yeah, I'm going to talk briefly about 10 years of implementation of the CITES Appendix II listing for European eel. But I'd like to start off, for those of you who are not really familiar with CITES, outline what CITES is and how it works, and then discuss, what the listing of European eel meant, and then to try to assess how effective this listing has been. CITES, for those who don't know, is a multilateral agreement which operates through an intergovernmental process. It combines wildlife and trade rights and obligations, and it's legally binding. And the aim is to achieve conservation and sustainable use objectives through trade regulation. It was agreed in 1973 and has been in force since 1975. It covers more than 36,000 species, and it also includes their parts and derivatives. They're covered by the listing. CITES has 183 parties to date, so you can see from the global map here that it pretty much has global coverage. There are some misconceptions about CITES I just want to clear up from the start. Some of these are that CITES deals with all aspects of wildlife conservation, that CITES aims to ban all wildlife trade, and that CITES regulates domestic trade. But the truth is that CITES deals only with international trade and only in those species that are included in the appendices. It does, rather than banning trade, CITES aims to regulate international trade, but for some species this trade is highly restricted. And CITES can only address international trade. It has no impact on domestic trade. Other misconceptions are that the CITES appendices are a listing of the world's endangered species, and that CITES imposes trade restrictions on developing countries and transition economies. But the appendices only list those species that are or may be affected by international trade, and this is why the CITES appendices do not necessarily reflect the IUCN Red List. And also, in terms of trade restrictions, there are obligations on both the producer and the consumer country in order to conserve and manage the resources. And CITES creates this framework for this international cooperation between countries. The three pillars of CITES, the three aims are: CITES regulated trade must be legal, sustainable, and traceable. And obviously, legal and sustainable trade can be beneficial for conservation of wild species, also for livelihoods and economies. And then illegal and unsustainable trade can pose a risk to species, people, and to businesses as well. So CITES is, species that are listed in CITES are put on one of three appendices, depending on the level of protection that they need. These are CITES appendices 1, 2, and 3. So in summary, Appendix 1 are the species that are threatened with extinction. Appendix 2 are species are not necessarily threatened with extinction, but for which trade must be regulated in order to avoid their becoming threatened. And Appendix 3 is species where a country has asked parties to help with its protection. And of the 36,000 species, almost 35,000 of them are on Appendix 2, which means that trade is permitted, but it is controlled. So in Appendix 1, there's about 1,000 species, and commercial trade in these species is generally prohibited. So that's a summary of how it works. So looking at European eel then, European eel is one of 16 species of anguillid eels, but it is the only one that is currently covered by CITES. And it was listed on Appendix 2, excuse me, in June 2007, and there was an 18-month delay in the implementation of this listing so that parties could put in place whatever measures they needed to be able to implement this correctly. So as an Appendix 2 species, like I said earlier, commercial trade in European eel can continue, or could continue, subject to the following. Management authority must make a legal acquisition finding, so it must be satisfied that a specimen of eel was not obtained in contravention with the laws of the state. And secondly, the scientific authority of the country, the state of export, must make what we call a non-detriment finding. So it must make a scientific assessment or give a scientific advice that the export will not be detrimental to the survival of the species. So a non-detriment finding, it's basically a science-based risk assessment. And this is very important. So trade in eel could continue under the Appendix II listing. So the main direct exporters of eel, so the ones that there are other countries like China, which will be a high re-exporter, so they import eels from Europe and then grow them on and then could export them. But the main direct exporters are Morocco, Tunisia, Turkey, Algeria, and Egypt. And of these 5 countries that are continuing to trade in eel, 3 of them, Morocco, Tunisia, and Algeria, are currently in the review of significant trade. So CITES is actually looking at the level of trade from these 3 countries and asking them to produce their non-detriment finding to show that the trade is sustainable. That's an ongoing process at the moment. And part of that is that these countries were asked to publish export quotas so that we can monitor the level of trade that is ongoing. And so in the case of Morocco, quota at the moment is for 500 tons of adult eel, which is grown on in aquaculture, but there's a 0 quota, export quota for glass eels, and there's a 5.5 ton quota for live adult eel. Tunisia has a 90 ton quota, but the specimens must be more than 30 centimeters long, and it also has a ban on a 0 quota for glass eel. And Algeria has an 8 ton quota, and again, no glass eel. Turkey has a 100 ton, it's not in the review significant trade process, but it has published a quota of 100 tons. So these are some of the ways that parties are being transparent about what they expect to export in this species. So an eel in the EU, it's slightly different because, as we heard, it's implemented through the EU wildlife trade regulations, and in many ways these are stricter than CITES, so they're considered stricter domestic measures. The EU member states were unable to make a non-detriment finding, an NDF for anguilla, and so in December 2010 they established a 0 export quota, and also they stopped imports from non-EU range states into the EU, and so this so-called ban remains in place today. So it's been in place since December 2010. We've also heard about the Eel Regulation, which sets out measures for the recovery. So in April of 2018, there was an international workshop in Kew Gardens where people came together to try to assess the effectiveness of the listing, because it had been in place for, I think, 9 years at that point. So what did we learn? The following slides basically summarize those discussions. So what did we learn? Well, we learned that determining how effective the listing is very difficult to assess. For a start, it's not clear what metrics you should use. What should you look at to decide whether it has been effective or not? And one possibility is to look at the 3 pillars of CITES to see if we have a legal, sustainable, and traceable trade. Also, we heard from Katarzyna earlier that the listing has been in place for a short time, and that the eel has a generation time of about 15 years, so maybe it's too soon to really determine whether this has had an impact. And also, there have been a number of different measures, not just the Appendix II listing of eel on CITES, but the EU trade ban came in force a year later. We also have the FCM measures. There's a lot of things happening at the same time. So how do you determine which element of that has had what proportion of the impact? So some of them have been, as I said, measures to conserve. We also have the Eel Regulation came in as well. Teasing apart whether any impacts that we see are down to the CITES listing is very, very difficult to do. The reality is that maybe without the CITES listing, some of these other things might not have happened. Because some of the potential positive things that came out of the CITES listing is that it raised the awareness and profile of the species. It also brought a range of sectors together, including marine and freshwater fisheries managers. As we know, eel is a complicated species to deal with because it's not one department. It has a marine stage and it has a freshwater stage. It brought together all these managers. It also created a political will to want to conserve and sustainably manage the species. It mobilized that will. These are all positives. There are some negatives as well. So it's likely that listing of European eel on CITES pushed the trade onto other less well understood species of eel. So the American eel, the Japanese eel, and Anguilla rostrata, marmorata, bicolor. And it also had the effect of pushing the trade in European eel underground. And we've seen an increase in the illegal trade in the species since, not just the CITES listing, but particularly since the EU ban. And another thing, as we heard from Jan-Dag, that there are a lot of different threats to eel, and so perhaps it has shifted the focus entirely onto dealing with the harvest and the trade as a driver of the decline. But we can't lose sight of the wider considerations, the other threats that are also facing eel. That's potentially some of the cons. Some of the lessons that we learned was that listing a species on Appendix II, putting it in CITES, is not an achievement in its own right. Unless you implement it correctly, then it's no use really. And I think also we've heard this with the Eel Regulation. It's one thing to have a regulation and the eel management plans, but they must be implemented properly. We also learned that the delay in listings, this 18-month preparation period, perhaps could have been used a little bit more constructively to set in place what we needed to be able to monitor the trade practices and then support the management of the species. We also learned that listing a species can shift the trade to another related species, and we need to monitor that to make sure that it doesn't result in another species then needing to be listed on CITES. And we also learned that there's a really strong need for a coordinated approach between all the relevant stakeholders, and this includes industry representatives. So work on eels in CITES continues. We have a new set of decisions that were just adopted at the Conference of the Parties last year. And these new decisions, they continue to encourage greater collaboration between eel range states, the transit and destination countries, in the conservation and management of the species, and also in particular in tackling illegal trade. And there's been many enforcement operations focusing on eels in recent years that has benefited from this greater collaboration. We also aim to encourage range states of non-CITES listed anguillid eels to improve the management of these species so that they then don't need to be listed on CITES and have their trade regulated. And we're also investigating the levels of trade and these emerging trends and trade patterns, as I said, shifting from one species to another, moving from wild caught to aquaculture, all of these kind of trends. So we have the whole picture. And then we're also looking at a range of issues, including making non-detriment findings, which is challenging. As we said, we have a single population, but trying to do a non-detriment finding can we do it at a regional basis or a country level, which is normally what we do. Also looking at traceability, dealing with the illegal trades, looking at the possibility of ranching is where the glass eels are taken, where the juvenile stage is taken away and ungrown, but this can only apply for a species has a low probability of surviving to adulthood in the wild. And we're looking to see if eel qualifies for this at the moment. And also looking to see if we could improve customs codes to improve the reporting. And obviously, the better your reporting, the better the data you have, then the better your analysis can be. And so that's all I have to say for now. So thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Karen, very much for that. It's a very complex situation for CITES, isn't it, following eel and the increased illegal trade as well. It's very interesting to hear a bit more about the evaluation that you did the other year. Okay, so we're going to open the floor for some questions, but first on to practicality. So basically we're running a little bit behind now, but obviously we also want to make the most of having all of these speakers and experts available to us. So I'm going to suggest 5 minutes of questions, and then again, we have a 5-minute break rather than 10 and start again at 20 past and go on to Melanie's presentation, and then you know, only lose 5 minutes of our general questions at the end. So if that's all right with everyone, I'm just going to hand over to Irene again. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Nikki. So we have some questions. The first one is from Max Wastio. You mentioned it also in your presentation, that the pressure on other ungulate species like the Japanese and the American eel has increased. Do you think, or is it possible that other eel species than the European eel should or can be listed on a similar appendix of the CITES regulation in order to minimize these effects?
Yeah, I can answer that. I should say that listing a species on the CITES appendices it's not an automatic process. It has to be a party that proposes it. So we are continuing to do all of these studies. They are made publicly available to everybody, but it would have to be a party that took that information and used it to put forward a proposal, and then the parties would vote, or well, would decide. And if it comes to they don't have a unanimous, a consensus decision, it would go to a vote as to whether it was listed or not. So it is entirely possible that somebody would put it forward, but it's important to stress it's not an automatic process.
Okay, thank you. That actually relates to another question from Michel Morin. He's asking if there's a common standard methodology to assess the export risk for a species, or is this only related to the state of the stock?
We have guidance on how to do a non-detriment finding, which is basically what you're saying there, this risk assessment as to whether you can export without there being any detriment to the species. And we have a resolution 16.7, which provides guidance on the sort of criteria that a party should take into account when they're doing this assessment. It may be a case that a party does not have all of the relevant information that it needs to be able to do this, and in those cases they should take a precautionary approach, and this is where the quotas come in. So they will establish a quota would not exceed, and these non-detriment findings are, it's an adaptive management style. So as you get more information, you're supposed to reassess, and then you can adjust your management accordingly and adjust your exports then, yeah.
Okay, great, thank you. Then I have a question from Jan Kappel. He's asking if you have any indications on what the UK will do, I assume after the Brexit. Will the same EU regulations and then also the CITES ban account for the UK after the Brexit, or do you have any idea on what the plans are for on this?
I'm not sure I'm in a position to answer on behalf of the UK, especially as an Irish person, but yeah, no, I think I would leave that to, maybe the Commission can answer that, but certainly it's, the CITES, the international regulations would still apply, and between the EU and the UK in terms of how they determine that.
But does it happen more often that a country that's first into the CITES regulation and then
no, what I mean is that the Appendix 2 listing and the requirements under Appendix 2 will apply to the UK. They apply to every country. The difference in the EU is that the EU has taken strict domestic measures, which any party is entitled to do on any species. So CITES sets the minimum, and the EU has established strict measures. So I think it's a political decision how the EU and the EU will decide to implement wildlife trade regulations post-Brexit, but it doesn't mean, it just means that the overall CITES regulations will continue to apply to the UK.
Okay, thank you. I think we're running out of time now, so that was it for this Q&A.
Yes. So I assume what you're meaning basically, Karen, is that for the UK, it's about whether, you know, if they want to they could either implement a national trade. I know we have several people from the UK with us, so you could, UK civil servants, or they could see if they could make the case for non-detrimental finding and open up some regulated trade. That's essentially what you're saying, right? Those are the options.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you everyone. So we're going to resume in 5 minutes and I will see you all then. Thank you.
Not very colorful, but they do have a strange beauty of their own. Their sinuous nocturnal movements through the water are mesmerizing to watch. And though they may resemble underwater snakes, eels are in fact a very interesting type of fish. There are several things about eels that make them unique besides their elongated shape and limbless bodies. For one thing, eels have the ability to breathe through their skin. Some can even leave the water and move over land for short periods. And unlike most migratory fish, such as salmon, which spawn in fresh water but live their adult lives in salt water, eels of the genus Anguilla migrate in the opposite direction, spawning and breeding in oceans and seas while spending most of their intervening time in freshwater. If we were to take one such freshwater eel and follow its life story, it would be born in the middle of the North Atlantic Ocean, about 1,000 miles east of Bermuda. This area, called the Sargasso Sea, forms the western part of a subtropical gyre, a giant whirlpool in the middle of the ocean. Our eel, let's call it Eli, would begin as one of 10 to 20 million tiny eggs carried by a female eel, hatching into a transparent leaf-shaped thing that looks nothing like an adult eel. Eli starts to drift in ocean currents, predominantly the Gulf Stream, towards either Europe or North America, depending on its particular species. Upon reaching the coast, Eli is about 2 inches long, looking more eely, but still transparent, known at this stage as a glass eel. But within a couple of days in freshwater, Eli's skin becomes pigmented a brownish black, now looking more like that of an adult eel. You might notice that we haven't mentioned anything about Eli's gender yet. That's because this is only determined once an eel enters freshwater, though nobody is sure exactly how that happens. Most of the eels that stay in the estuaries and brackish water become males, while those that go upstream become females, growing up to 2 to 3 times bigger than their future mates. In this case, it turns out that Eli was actually short for Elaine. As a female eel, Elaine will be quite solitary for most of her life in the stream, eating whatever falls in the water: grasshoppers, crickets, small fish, insect larvae, frogs, baby birds, almost anything she can get her mouth around. And she will grow quite big, up to 4 feet long and weighing as much as 13 pounds. We don't know exactly how freshwater eels know when it's time to return to the ocean, but something calls to them, and their fall migration is one of the largest unseen migrations on the planet. As Elaine leaves freshwater for the ocean, she undergoes a shocking metamorphosis. Her eyes enlarge by about 10 times. Her skin gets thicker, and her fins get larger. These are most likely adaptations for their upcoming ocean travel, and Elaine seamlessly makes the transition from fresh to saltwater, which would be toxic for most other fish. Once Elaine leaves the mouth of the freshwater streams, she will disappear completely from human view. No one has witnessed or been able to follow an adult eel on their migration, nor do we know how deep they spawn. But it's assumed that they can follow some signs that they can detect, such as a thermal barrier between ocean currents or a salinity front, in order to return to the same area of the ocean where they were born. Because we don't even know exactly what happens during an eel's migration, we can only imagine what the actual breeding looks like. But the common hypothesis is that Elaine and thousands or hundreds of thousands of other eels gather in large intertwined masses and release their eggs and sperm in a giant orgy known as panmixia. A couple of days after the eggs are laid, they hatch and the cycle begins again. And because we've never seen the adult eels returning up the freshwater rivers, we must assume that, having completed their long and roundabout journey, these amazing and mysterious creatures finally die there, in the same place where they were born. Goodbye, Elaine. It was a pleasure knowing you.
welcome back, everyone. And I want to introduce you to our final speaker of this morning, Melanie Virtue, who's head of the aquatic species team at the Convention for Migratory Species. And I think this is actually the only body that we have globally that could possibly help us manage eel throughout, European eel throughout its entire geographical range, since it covers so many different countries in its life cycle. So Melanie, I'm going to hand over to you now, and I think you've forgotten to unmute yourself, sorry.
Sorry, you can hear me now. Sorry, I've gone on to presentation view already. Despite having practiced this yesterday, I'm not doing so well now. Can you see my screen then?
Not yet.
Not
but
yet.
You're doing great.
Sorry.
We've all had a steep learning curve over the last few weeks already in terms
Yes.
of shifting our working practices.
Yes, and for some reason we're not encouraged to use Zoom in the UN, and so it's not something that I actually normally do presentations on.
How are you doing with the screen sharing?
We're getting there.
Okay.
I think.
Oh yes.
Okay.
Great.
And
I'm
you
going
see
to
my
mute
screen
myself
now.
now. Yep.
Good. Okay. So. Okay, now you can see my presentation, hopefully. Or you're seeing the two screens.
You're fine, Melanie. It's just one screen. Yeah.
Okay, one screen now. No, it's the two screens.
No, it's two, yeah.
Okay, now you're seeing the one screen.
Yeah.
Perfect. Okay, sorry about that. So hello, I'm Melanie Virtue from the Convention on Migratory Species, and I'm very glad to be invited here today. It's a good opportunity for us at CMS to reach out to a wider audience of people. It's great to have so many of you online today. So because I know not everybody would be familiar with CMS, I just wanted to give a little bit of background as well. So the Convention on Migratory Species, like CITES, we're a global treaty. We have slightly fewer parties, 130. We have all of Europe and nearly all of Africa. We're a little bit missing North America and Russia. But in terms of the European eel range states, we have almost all of them. The CMS is a framework convention. We also have a number of agreements on either specific species or groups of species under CMS. And CMS covers everything from the high seas to inland waterways. So it's very comprehensive in terms of the eel habitat. We're based in Bonn in Germany. And our overall goal is the conservation of migratory species and their habitats throughout their entire range. So in a way, we're very sort of complementary to CITES. He's dealing with the trade aspects and only international. We're dealing also with domestic issues and conservation and protection of habitat. And like CITES, we also have appendices, but they're slightly different in what they mean. Appendix 1 is migratory species threatened with extinction. And if a species is listed on Appendix 1, then there would be no taking of those animals except under exceptional circumstances. But Appendix 2 is somewhat different from CITES. It's an appendix for listing species that might benefit from some form of international cooperation. maybe to develop a legally binding agreement or a non-legally binding agreement or some other form of cooperation such as an action plan, which I'll talk about in a moment. So the European eel was listed on Appendix II of CMS in 2014. So that is, on the appendix, that just means that parties agree that international cooperation is required and that they would like to work towards some form of cooperation. And I think we've seen a similar map to this before. So in green are all the CMS, sorry, all the coloured countries here that are named are range states to the eel, and all the green ones are CMS parties. So only Turkey and Russia are not parties to CMS. Austria also has informed us that they believe they are not a range state to the eel, but we haven't changed the map there. So just a history then of what's been happening under CMS since the species was listed in 2014. We've already had 3 meetings. I know quite a few of you online today have been to some of the meetings. Our first meeting in 2016 in Ireland was a meeting largely of experts, both of the European eel as well as the American eel, and attended by some of the European range states. And then in 2018, we had a meeting where we really focused on getting as many of the European range states there as possible, including a couple from North Africa. And then we had a third meeting just a year ago, also in Malmo, wonderful place to have meetings. And that's what the photo thereof is of. And at that meeting, we discussed potential instruments that we could have for cooperation under CMS, and the sort of consensus arose out of the meeting that an action plan, which is a non-legally binding instrument, would be perhaps the best way to go forward for CMS at the moment. And the meeting requested then that the CMS COP would look further into that, which indeed it did. So our COP was probably one of the very last big international meetings to be held before COVID stopped us all in our tracks. So we met in India in February of this year, and at the meeting the eel was discussed. Parties considered an outline of the draft action plan, requested the Secretariat to continue with consultations with the range states. It had adopted a number of decisions to this effect, and it anticipated adoption of an action plan at or before our COP14 to be in 2023, all going well. So then this is where we are now. We're in the process of having further consultations with range states and other stakeholders, like so many of you here today. And already a week or so ago, we have sent out to all of the range states and stakeholders who have attended our previous meeting like a 0 draft of the single species action plan for the eel. And we've sent it out initially just for any comments on the structure and on the way we're proceeding, because I think at our previous meetings we were perhaps going a little bit fast for all range states and all stakeholders. So we're doing a kind of a 2-step process where we've put together the sort of the outline of the draft, and we're just getting comments on that outline at the moment until the end of June. And then once we get those comments, we're then going to flesh out the draft more and undertake sort of sub-regional consultations, like for example with the Mediterranean states, with the Baltic states, taking advantage of being able to do these online webinars like this. And we want to get some more sort of detailed response from the different sub-regions. And then we'll go through an iterative process of developing, first draft, second draft, maybe third draft if necessary, of the action plan. And then leading up, I mean, we would like to perhaps have had a meeting earlier, but it seems like it'll be a little while before we can hold a meeting in person. Sweden has very kindly offered to host our next meeting again, but maybe not in Malmo and Gothenburg. And obviously we can't say yet when that will happen, but I think we can do a lot of productive work online at this point, developing and commenting on the drafts. NGOs and other IGOs, obviously we work closely with CITES, we're working with the European Commission, with FAO, and inputs are encouraged from all NGOs and IGOs who are interested. And then eventually we hope to have an action plan adopted before our next Conference of the Parties in 2023. And our standing committee has been authorised to do the adoption once it's been signed off by range states. So I think I'll just leave it there and take any questions that you have, but just like to say that we work very closely with and would like to thank the support received from the Sargasso Sea Commission, who have co-funded the previous meetings we've held together with the Principality of Monaco, and the government of Sweden itself. So thank you. I'll hand it back.
Thank you very much, Melanie, for that very good overview of the CMS process and what's happening now. You're completely right that your meeting, the COPE, was probably one of the last, big meetings that were held, and obviously this was going to be a really big year for biodiversity with the convention of with the Biodiversity Convention and several other big meetings which have now been postponed, and you managed to just squeeze in there before we were all placed on lockdown. So has that, I mean, from your perspective, having had that decision come and then everything being closed down, do you feel that you've still managed to move on with developing the action plan, or has that created a lot of difficulties for you?
Oh, no, not at all. In fact, the timing was perfect for us because we got our mandate to move forward, and then the next step anyway was working on drafting and sending things out for comment. So we're actually not impacted really at all at the moment. I guess the question will be, how long it is before we can convene the range states again, because working online is great for commenting on drafts, but it eventually becomes a time when, to really negotiate a final version of something, it's much more convenient to meet in person. So hopefully we'll be able to do that in the not too distant future.
Okay, I'm going to hand over to Irene for questions from all of the attendees. And after another 5 minutes or so questions to Melanie, we'll just move into the opening questions to all speakers. So you can start posting questions to all speakers for the next session as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Nikki. We have a question from Sami. He or she is asking, what is the regular way for NGOs to take part in the single species action plan that's being developed by the CMS?
Well, that's a good question. So, I mean, we've been interacting already with a number of NGOs who have in the past expressed an interest, in working with us and have been invited, free to attend the previous meetings we've held. And I mean, right at the moment, I've only sent the 0 draft out to those who were already engaged, because we've just really asked to make sure that we've incorporated everything that was anticipated and expected. But once this round is over at the end of June, any next round, we're very happy to send out to any other NGOs who are interested, and we can just increase our mailing list. There's absolutely no problem with that. All stakeholders are very welcome to participate. So you can either email me directly or get in contact through FishSec or however you'd best like to let us know.
Okay, thank you. We have another question from Beate. She's asking, how will the species action plan under the CMS be coordinated or monitored once it is adopted? Is there an existing mechanism for this in the CMS?
That's a good question. So CMS has a number of action plans for different species, birds, reptiles, mammals, etc. And it's really up to the range states and the parties, the level to which they want to sort of engage in that. And some, we have just a kind of, regular correspondence with the range states. If there's just a few, for example, I also manage an action plan on loggerhead turtles in the Pacific, going from Australia across to the Latin American Pacific coast. And the range states are very few, and we just cooperate by email. Generally, we've only met once in the actual adoption of the action plan. For bigger action plans where more range states are involved, and this is a big one with approximately 50 range states. For example, for some of the bird ones, CMS or one of our agreements, the African Eurasian Waterbird Agreement, they actually have a staff member, in the Secretariat whose paid for by range states, and their task is full-time coordinating the action plan. So, and then that's kind of like the gold standard, but sort of anywhere in between can also be done. I mean, it's my job to administer the action plans, the aquatic action plans in CMS. And obviously there's only one of me, and there's a number of action plans and other agreements. And so limited amount of time I have, but the more resources that range states and other interested stakeholders put into the process, the more often we can either convene meetings or webinars, or hire consultants to help us draft things, or as I said, the gold standard would be being able to actually have a staff member on site who administers it full time. So it's quite a range of possibilities.
All right, great. Thank you. We don't have any more questions for this presentation specifically, so I think we can go to the Q&A session. Nikki, do you want to explain anything further?
I don't really need to explain anything further. I think I could just say that, the question and answer box is now open for questions for all speakers, and bear with Irene and Clarice. They're trying to manage the questions that are coming in. And then it would be good, I suppose, if you actually, it would be helpful for them if you write which speaker you are asking. It would just make the process a little bit faster for us to deliver the questions, maybe. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. So I'll start with a question from Niels Hoogland from the Coalition Clean Baltic. He actually asked this question during Melanie's presentation, so I think it's mainly directed to you, but it's also a bit general. It's quite long, so I'll read it out loud. He says, listening to the several of the speakers, it seems obvious that the focus on national is conflicting with the international needs of the eel. So our strong recommendation has been to all countries and the EU Commission that there must be more cross-border cooperation, and instead of national plans, consider regional or sub-regional plans. Is this a potential outcome that the Commission is considering as part of, for example, a common implementation strategy? Or can this regional approach be the key for the CMS action plan? So I think this is directed to Katarzyna and Melanie mainly. I hope you understand the question. Who wants to?
Maybe Katarzyna would like to start, and I can add something.
Yes, thank you. Well, thank you, Niels, for raising this question. I would not say that the national approach can be considered conflicting, because the aim under the Eel Regulation was to allow for some kind of flexibility how member states would apply different measures to address specificities of their country rivers. I do agree that more cross-border cooperation is needed, not only at international level, also within the EU. We have so far only one transboundary eel management plan. There are some cooperation between different countries to work together. As evaluation has found that actually, until we have significant signs of the recovery, at that moment we could consider thinking about the management plan like a general one. So for the time being, we are still hoping that the implementation will be strengthened, and we will have more cooperation in different areas, including an international level to help the eel. Thank you, Melanie.
Yeah, and I mean, just to add to that, I mean, obviously CMS's strength in this and its niche is the fact that we bring together all the range states and not just the EU, and that you know, one of the things that CMS tends to focus on mostly really is transboundary issues, you know, particularly with, you know, barriers to migration. These are often, you know, crossing national boundaries. And so, I mean, I think through this action plan, we can certainly, as we develop the action plan, we can certainly see where any transboundary cooperation may be required. And, you know, if necessary, that can, you know, develop into, you know, into other things, either contained within our action plan or, you know, into other initiatives on the side of it. And of course, you know, just to reiterate that, you know, CMS covers not only, you know, national habitats, but also international waters. And of course, the Sargasso Sea is obviously vitally important habitat for the eel. And, you know, we're working with the Sargasso Sea Commission, you know, to see how we can exactly bring that in, you know, into the action plan and into the work we're doing.
All right, thank you, Melanie. Then we have another question from Ramon to Olle. Ramon is asking if it is better to set an eel ladder with free exit for elvers in a barrier where upstream there can be exotic piscivorous fish species, or would it better to avoid to set this eel ladder if it's not possible to collect all the elvers that have climbed?
Yeah, I saw that question. It's a tricky one. I can't say. I mean, of course, if you have a very high mortality upstream, it doesn't make sense to pass the elvers. But yeah, it's difficult to say anything about that without knowing more.
So yeah, so that would be a difficult trade-off and hard to measure what the mortality will be.
Yeah, I guess it's common sense. If you pass fish on to an area where they can't survive or feed and so on, then it sounds like a bad idea.
All right, thank you. Then I have a question from Katalin to Katarzyna. What are the plans of the European Commission if there are plans to improve the traceability of eels in the EU?
Yes, thank you. Well, actually, that's part of our evaluation. We have explained that, yes, there are issues with traceability. However, part of the problems would be solved once the Commission proposal to amend the control regulation would be adopted by the co-legislator. There we have put measures to cover small-scale fisheries. We have put measures, obligations to use electronic reporting, and it would help to make traceability more effective. And of course, it's for all the fish species and the fish products, not only for eels, but it definitely would help eel, because we know there is a big problem with eel being transported across the borders, and also there is a problem with illegal trade. So we are hoping that part of the problem would be solved, but of course we will see what the end effect will be once negotiations are finalized. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Then I have a question for Nikki. I think you can best answer this. Giaconda is asking if the attendees will have access to the presentations. So I think it will be good to share something about this for the attendees now.
Okay, this is a practical question. So yeah, so aside from the fact that we're live streaming now, obviously I'm hoping that that is working all right, since we can't actually see it while we're doing the seminar. We've been recording the entire webinar this morning, and we will try to make it available on our websites or in some other channel. And I think we'll basically send out an email to maybe the whole invitation list, so that both the people who actually participated and all of the people who for different reasons could not participate today knows how to find the recordings. Thank you.
Thank you, Nikki. I'm just going through the question. Yeah, I have a question from Antonio to Karen. She is asking you, thank you for the accurate and clear presentation. And he's asking, would the European eel be better off had the EU Commission regulate through a quota system while the non-detrimental finding is achieved to avoid illegal trades? It's a difficult one. Oh, you're muted still.
I'm muted, yeah, no, I'm unmuted now. And yes, thank you, Antonio. I know Antonio well, so thank you for this question. It's a very interesting question because it's very difficult to know. I guess one of the things take into consideration is when we look at a non-detriment finding, we're looking at all offtake, so everything that impacts on the species, so the harvest and all that. So I guess if a quota system could be established and but with no increase in the harvest, so it's taken out of the existing harvest, but it is an interesting thing to say, if you can feed that market demand, would that actually kill the illegal trade? It's not clear. I mean, we have done similar exercises with other species where we look at, you know, using the example of having one-off sales of ivory to flood the market to see does it have an impact on the poaching levels of elephants. But it's not clear whether it had any benefit or any positive or negative impact. So again, it's not clear here, but yeah, interesting. Thank you, Antonio. I'll have to think about that one a little bit more. But yeah, it's a very, very difficult question to answer, especially since there are so many other things at play here. It's not just the site, it's not just international trade that's having an impact here. So yeah.
All right, thank you. That's very clear. Let me see. There are many questions coming in. I have a question from Jose Luis Garcia. I think it would be directed to Katarzyna. He's saying it seems that the eel is a big challenge for the Commission and member states. It's probably the only species with wide European distribution, affecting different European policies, such as fisheries, freshwater policies, and conservation. Could the status of the eel population in Europe be used as an indicator to measure the Green Deal effectiveness? So.
Yeah, thank you. Wow, that's interesting suggestion. Definitely, EU biodiversity strategy makes a very big step towards addressing biodiversity loss. And to my understanding, in the Commission, especially services of digital environment, are working on the action plan, and there would be some actions how to measure the progress made. So I take this message home, and that's an idea that could potentially be considered. So thank you for all the ideas that are coming in this workshop. All together we can try to make a difference and improve the situation. So yeah, I'm noting down. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I have a question also from Jose Luis to Jan-Dag. Do you know how the situation is in the Sargasso Sea in relation to climate change, and if that will be affecting the eel recruitment at the moment? Because I also often see it as one of the factors that's impacting the European eel recruitment, but what are actually the information and data we have on this?
I'm not sure if I understand the question correctly. I have read it. Well, we have some data on the abundance of leptocephali larvae in the Sargasso Sea from the recent cruises, and we do know that it's lower than it used to be tens and hundreds of years ago compared to historical data. Of course, that's kind of difficult to standardize the catches from today and compare them to the catches from the past. In relation to climate change, there is no definite link to the recruitment and climate change in the Sargasso Sea. There's more of a hypothesis going on that climate change affects, for example, the food conditions in the Sargasso Sea that might relate to larval survival or to hydrographic conditions in the Sargasso Sea, and through this can affect recruitment. But I think it's too early to make a definite statement on whether oceanic factors are a major cause for the decline in recruitment.
All right, thank you. I think that would answer the question. Then I have another question from Charles Berkow. It's actually directed towards almost everyone, all the speakers, Katarzyna, Karen, and anyone else who wants to share their opinion on this. He's saying that given the connections between fishing of glass eels on the one hand and illegal fishing and illegal exports on the other hand, do we know enough about the benefits of restocking for silver eel escapement to justify glass eel fishing by its contribution to restocking? Who wants to share their opinion or knowledge on this?
Well, I think it's a question about benefits of restocking. We have been also having this part analyzed in the evaluation, but of course it's based on the science. And here I'm looking at Jan-Dag that could provide more scientific justification or information about, because we know there are some questions. We do at current stage still consider restocking as a conservation measures if it contributes to the achievement of the objective of the Eel Regulation. So this is our line. However, indeed, the practices of restocking could be improved in certain member states. And then maybe Jan-Dag can also add something on this.
Sorry, can you repeat the question? The question, I was just a bit distracted.
Yeah, sure, I can. The question is, there's a lot of restocking being done, but there's also a lot of illegal fishing and illegal glass eel exports. And the question is whether we know enough about the benefits of silver eel escapement because of restocking to justify glass eel fishing by its contribution to restocking. So whether the benefit of restocking is enough to justify the illegal trade of glass eels that's currently happening because of the glass eel fisheries.
I'm a bit confused. To justify the illegal trade is a bit it sounds weird. No, I don't. This is a weird way of putting it, I think. If we know enough about the net benefit of stocking to justify glass eel fisheries, because as a matter of fact, we don't know about the net benefit of stocking at all. That doesn't mean that we need to close all glass eel fisheries, on the other hand. So I wouldn't, I wouldn't approach it that way. So there's really no straight answer to that question.
All right, thank you. So we have a question from Max Wasio to Karen. To what extent was the possibility of extreme increase of illegal trade in European eel taken into account when the export ban was introduced? And what measures were taken to minimize this effect?
Thank you, Max, but I actually don't think this is really a question for me, because it was not CITES that implemented the export ban. It's an EU measure, so it would be the EU that would be able to answer that question as to what they took into account when they implemented that ban. So apologies, yeah.
Okay, I understand, yeah. Maybe Katarzyna can shed something about this, or?
Well, to my knowledge, it's exactly as Karen was saying. It's member states' decision to take this measure that is based on the recent science, and every year the situation is reevaluated. And at current situation, given that the stock is still in critical state, they maintain decision that was taken in 2010. So it had not changed since then. So I think we need significant signs of improvement of the recovery to reconsider going in a different direction. But currently, no change in export-import restrictions that we have in the EU. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I have another question. Yeah, a question for Olle from Niels Hoogland of the Coalition Clean Baltic. He's asking you, even considering that each site is specific, can the cost of mitigation measures decrease if more dams are addressed? So do you think that there is a skill-up gain to be made in the end?
Short answer, yes. Okay. Some aspects of the total cost can obviously be reduced as we learn more, as the consultants learn more.
Okay, thank you. Nikki, I'm looking at you. I think it's time to. I
think you're right. We're coming to an end. I'm sorry, we've had to be very restrictive, obviously, with how many different speakers that we invite to keep it manageable. We've had in the Q&As, we've had quite a lot of, we could have had some input maybe from the GFCM process, which maybe we can try to follow up in some other way. I want to thank especially Elisabetta Morello for suggesting, you know, that she could give a quite quick summary of the GFCM process. We know that that's a region where a lot is happening on eel at the moment, and it deserves attention. But in the end, we choose to have a more limited time today in order to make it, to maximize both participation and also, you know, to make it possible for us to pull through. It's quite exhausting sometimes with long online meetings. So we've come to the end of today, and I want to thank all of the speakers for giving their time and their expertise to this opportunity to update a wider community of what's going on with European eel during this very strange time. Thank you very much. It was incredibly valuable for us, and I hope for everybody else as well. Want to thank all of the attendees for joining us so enthusiastically, and thank you very much for that. And then finally, I would also like to thank all of the people in our organizations, of course, who've helped organize today. And yeah, keep your eyes on us. I think both the Fisheries Secretariat and the Good Fish Foundation, we're going to continue to do a lot of work on European eel now for the forthcoming future. So if you're interested, you can also sign up to our monthly newsletter specifically on eel. Thank you so much, everyone, today. And with this, I want to close the meeting. Thank you.